Did it ever strike you as odd when you hear this story that Mary and Joseph would have traveled an entire day without noticing that Jesus wasn't with them? You know, we've all heard stories of those families with a bunch of kids traveling by car, and they're stopping at a rest stop, and when they pile back into the car and pull out, they realize that one of the children is missing. And they immediately turn the car around and they fetch the one who didn't get in the back seat with the others. But traveling an entire day before noticing Jesus' absence? What were Mary and Joseph thinking? And they only had one kid to keep an eye on. Well, biblical historians say that the strongest emotional bond in the Mediterranean world was between mother and young son. The father's influence on the son, that didn't begin until puberty, when the son got shoved out of the comfort of the women's world and into the harsh and hierarchical men's world. But the 12-year-old Jesus, he was in that transitional stage between worlds of mother and father. And in the caravan, people traveled according to gender, just as their society was strictly divided, So, each parent would very well have concluded that Jesus was over there someplace with the others. Mary would have been proud that Jesus was with the men. And Joseph would have thought that, Jesus had returned to the comfort of the women for this one. You parents who have or had adolescents, you all can testify to the difficulties that moms and dads and their children face at this very peculiar stage in a child's life. So when they find Jesus in the company of the adult men and teachers, Mary and Joseph might actually been a little proud that Jesus had made the transition successfully. But Jesus still wasn't an adult male, and he failed to inform his parents of his intention. That's why we get Mary's tone of irritation here. In that close-knit world of the Mediterranean people, such accountability would have been expected. So really, it doesn't sound like raising children in Jesus' world has changed all that much from now. But this story really isn't about the ideal holy family. That's not what Luke is stressing. Instead, St. Luke seems to be making a statement about Jesus' identity. He is showing very early in his gospel who Jesus is and what his purpose was. In the history of all great people, there are usually stories of how remarkable these people were in their youth. These stories suggest that signs of their future greatness was actually evident in their early childhood. What the renowned person did in their childhood was a preview into their adulthood. But almost all of Jesus' childhood is unknown to us. It's his hidden life. Today's finding of Jesus by his parents in the temple, that is our sole boyhood gospel story. But it does give us a glimpse into the man who Jesus would become. Jesus explains to his parents, "Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" Luke focuses on that pronouncement. That's the crux of his story. His Father's house may have several meanings. One is that he had to be about the business of his Father. But house could also be inclusive of all members who form the community of his Father's house. What comes through to us is that Jesus is in a very special relationship with God. That's the awareness that will follow him throughout his entire ministry. Jesus has been sent on a mission which will determine everything that he will do and say. At this point of the gospel, his parents do not understand what he said to them. And even that anticipates people, including his own disciples, who just don't get who Jesus is and what he's asking of them. This story begins with the family observing the yearly custom of going with other devout Jews to Jerusalem for the Passover. And this little glimpse of Jerusalem at the Passover time, this also anticipates the journey that the adult Jesus and his disciples will make later on. Throughout the gospel, Jesus will be about the business of his Father's house, even though it will ultimately mean his death. Jesus manifests his wisdom as a boy in the temple, and it is in the temple where he's going to end his teaching. Jesus wasn't simply a precocious child who grew up to be a mesmerizing teacher. Jesus speaks of God and for God with an authority that is well beyond the teachings of the law. He was in a unique relationship with God, and he dwelt always in his Father's house. The source of Jesus' wisdom was not from acquired learning. So today's gospel story is not a quaint story about Jesus' early adolescence. It is a story that identifies Jesus' early in his life, and it shines a light on who he was and who he would dedicate his life to. This gospel isn't just a selection of the accounts of the historical life of Jesus. Rather, from the beginning of the gospel, there is a narrative of God's unfolding plan for our salvation through the person of Jesus. Mary and Joseph did not understand the implication of Jesus' response to them. He obeys his parents, but the understory reveals his special relationship with his heavenly Father. And like Mary and Joseph, little by little, we are going to learn more about Jesus and his implication of his life for us. Meanwhile, as Luke's gospel progresses each Sunday throughout this liturgical year, as we dwell in the Father's house with Jesus and one another, we all will come to know who our God is through Jesus and what response we are called to make through him. As we hear Luke's gospel proclaimed this year, we acknowledge our confusion and our lack of understanding to what God is asking of us. Mary is our model in this listening process. Like her, we resolve to keep all things in our hearts, with the hope that more will be revealed on the journey with Jesus to Jerusalem for the life-giving Passover that he's going to enter into. Jesus' death at Passion time is not the end of the story. We will get a fuller understanding of who Jesus is at Easter, and then with his disciples who entertained the stranger on the road to Emmaus, we will recognize the risen Christ right here in our midst. Our hearts will be set on fire by his words, and our eyes opened by the breaking of the bread. Mary and Joseph preceded us on the road to faith. And with them, we are at the beginning of the story right now. But in this really short episode, There are contained the seeds of the entire gospel. And we are invited to meditate constantly on it as it illuminates for us who Jesus really was. So let us be a part of the Holy Family throughout this whole year. Joseph is our model of the just person who submits his life to God's call, even though it contradicts his initial plans. And then let us accompany Mary, as with her, we will look and listen to the unfolding events and join her as we keep all of these things in our hearts.